All right, I'm going to start out by showing how we start the directory instance in the pre-work on Azure specifically. So the one thing that I have to do up front is create a resource group. In the previous video, I deleted that resource group and all of the resources that are attached to it. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I actually clicked on resource groups in the Azure portal, and I'm going to add, and you can just give it any name. So I like it to be easily identifiable for our admins. So I use my email ID, Gregory G-RG for resource group. Either in the SE account or the SA account, or subscription I should say, you will only have one subscription to choose from most likely unless you have created your own, and you can choose your region. So we will create that, and it's very fast to create. Not all things on the cloud are, but this one is. And so we'll continue with our script. So we start with the page that has the pre-work on it and the instructions for it, and that's on public GitHub under Gregory G/Magathon-Director. So what we look at, the first thing we do if we're doing Azure, and remember, you're very welcome to try this on other cloud platforms. The scripts are assuming Azure for now. So we install the Azure CLI according to Microsoft's directions on Mac OS. It's very simple. Brew install, and then you will have to do AZ login to get that command line client authenticated to your account with your subscription. I will not go through that, but that's all part of the instructions shown on the Microsoft documentation. And then to verify that things are working, let's switch to a shell. This is just a shell on my local MacBook. The command line client is called AZ, and there are many categories that you can look at. AZ VM, you can look at resources, you can look at all kinds of different things. I'm piping this, there's a lot of JSON that this will output. Just to list the VMs in your subscription is going to be overwhelming amount of output. So I'm piping it into JQ, which I highly recommend to parse. It's a command line utility to parse through and select JSON. And I'm just picking out the name and then looking at the first 20 of those. So this will prove that my Azure client is in fact talking to my subscription. So there's a bunch of VMs that are currently running the same VMs that you'll see from the console. All right, so let's proceed to the next step. So we will move on to the next step, which is provisioning, installing and configuring the director instance by means of the Provision Azure shell script that's included in the repository that you just downloaded. So we start by using the script, and it has a number of parameters. Let me switch to that very quickly. There are various shell environment variables that you might want to set. You might need to set these. If the owner tag that you want to stamp your instances with, this is very important for our admins to have the owner tag. Then if it's different than your shell Unix user, then you can set that specifically. Same for SSH username. If you want a different SSH username on the instance that's created, you set that. Same with, you have to specify your resource group and basically the instance name that you're giving it. So I'm going to call mine GG-director, for example. And if there's a specific key that you use that you need your instances to use, there almost certainly will be, then you specify that SSH key. So therefore, the command line will look probably as it's shown here. where you set those variables that you want to specify, and then run the provisioning script. So I'm going to do that with my parameters, and we'll see how that proceeds. So here's the command line as I will run it. And we start it. The script will verify. This is an interactive script. There's a couple times where you have to follow some prompts. So at the very beginning, it shows you what the values are that it's using and validates that you really want to use those. So I will say yes here. And then it will say, please remember to use default DNS for your virtual network on Azure. If you don't have, if you followed along the way I did with the beginning, deleting all the resources in your resource group, you won't have this problem to look at. But if you did not, and you are reusing an already existing virtual network, let's take a look at what that looks like. Then you'll need to go into the virtual network that you're using in the console, choose DNS servers, and just make sure that it's the default DNS that comes out of the box with Azure instances. We're going to change that and specify a custom DNS, which is absolutely necessary to run our clusters on Azure, but we start with the default DNS, just for clarity. And then as that runs, we can periodically go back and look at the resources that are being created under our resource group, which will include a running virtual machine, as well as the things that are required to support that. So this is the only instance that will have a public IP address. The instances in our cluster will not. They'll rely on this instance to be a NAT instance, basically, and find their way to the internet and to get name resolution for the other member nodes in the cluster. So this takes some time, and we'll continue as the script proceeds. And the script has continued. So let me show you briefly what that did. After it called the Azure CLI to bring up the instance, then I create a, if you're on Linux or Mac OS or Cygwin on Windows or Ubuntu on Windows 10, then this will work. It will fix up an SSH client configuration file for you so that you can simply say SSH Azure-director, and it will take care of all of the authentication and log you on. So it fixes up the SSH config file. I already had an entry in my case. So for the Azure director entry, it updated it with the current IP address that was created by the Azure CLI. Then we install a whole bunch of software. Basically, remember, everything is going to get installed on this instance that's required for Java 8, Director 6, MariaDB, and Bind. So a lot of what you see go by is just all of that installation happening. At a certain point, we were asked to update the DNS. And I didn't show the interactive portion here, but the script does pause here. Remember, this is an interactive script, and tells you that it's going to install Bind. So you press enter at that point, it installs Bind, and then it tells you that you should enter the internal fully qualified domain name for the internal network. And I recommend sticking with cdhcluster.internal so that the rest of the scripts will work, because they expect that this will be the internal FQDN. And then it goes and has you update the configuration of the virtual network. And I am going to show that just briefly. When you are running something and you know your virtual network that your instance is using, you can just click directly on that. But if you don't know it, you can go to your list of virtual machines, and the typical way you do this is deselect other resource groups and find your own resource group, and then click off of that, and that will initiate a filter for all the instances. So in this case, I only have one instance running in my resource group. If I click on that, then I'll see the virtual network. And clicking on that takes me to the screen where I can choose DNS. So when I brought it up initially, recall from the earlier part of the video, the default DNS server was selected. I chose custom and put in the IP address that it told me to in the script. This is the internal IP of this instance. And then click Save. I then tabbed back, and you hit enter, and then it goes and does a bunch of sanity checks. Its first attempt to run the basically reverse DNS failed, but after a reboot it was working. So I just let that be. Just keep in mind this might be your experience as well. It might work the first time. You might go back after it reboots and double check. It tells me that the Cloudera director will be or should be running at this domain. So this is gg-director dot and then our internal domain. And because I have a proxy set up, and you have the proxy in the repository that you downloaded so that you can modify it for your own needs, this domain name, this cdhcluster.internal, will be recognized as a proxy or as something to invoke the proxy. So let's just try that right now. I'm going to go to that URL. And sure enough, through the proxy, I see that Cloudera Director is running. The first time it runs, you have to accept a license, and then you can log in. At this point, you can feel free, if you know Director already, or if you want to be acquainted with the wizards that are available, especially the wizard as of Director 2.8 and Director 6 for easy setup of clusters, you can do that. And anytime you have a cluster running, you're able to export the configuration. But in our case, in our repository that we downloaded, there is a configs directory with a working config for multiple cloud platforms. And we'll go into that in the next video about how we do that and actually get a cluster running with our newly minted director instance.